What's Thailand's problem? Thailand's problem is right now they're producing zero. So when they start their production, look at where their costs are. So unless Thailand can get its production out to Q1 or above, Thailand will be losing money. And every Thai watch companies will be, or investors, will be losing money on all the watches that they're making. Right? Because the world price is set back here. The world price is being set by the Swiss watch industry. So until the Thai industry can get big enough to bring its average cost down to a level that's at least at the world price charged by the Swiss watch industry, or presumably further, they're bleeding through their venture capital or investors' funds very, very rapidly. So in this case, what we could say is Thailand has a potential comparative advantage, but a comparative advantage only exists if you're actually in production. And in this particular case, they have to get into production. Now notice one of the things. How high this curve is at very low production costs depends upon what your startup costs or your fixed costs are. So the greater your fixed costs, even for an external economies of scale, the more difficult it's going to be for a new entrant to break a new entrant country or industry to break into the world market. So notice what we have here. Thailand has a comparative advantage. And we've already learned, if you have a comparative advantage, you should be the person specializing in the production, you, country or industry, should be the one specializing in the production of that good. But Switzerland, by the simple fact that it got to the industry first and got big, actually ends up supplying the world market. So notice then that we actually have, we probably actually have a disadvantageous, that was easy to say, disadvantageous pattern of specialization and trade. We know, even though we haven't considered any other industries here, we know that if Thailand has a comparative advantage in watches, Switzerland will have a comparative advantage in something else. Nevertheless, notice that here, unless Thailand can start producing greater than Q1, it's still advantageous to the world to have Switzerland produce watches, because they'll be producing watches at a lower equilibrium price than Thailand can charge. So as long as that persists, then we end up with a both disadvantageous pattern of trade, but also a benefit to the world economy. Now, one of the arguments that we could make is that if Thailand really does have the comparative advantage, maybe one of the things that we could do is impose trade restrictions or trade protection to try to promote the Thai watch industry. To get it going, may require tariffs against the import of Swiss watches or export subsidies on Thai watches in order for the industry to grow large enough so that we would then see the industry over time begin to switch from a predominantly Swiss-based industry to a predominantly Thai-based industry. So in essence, this is something, by the way, that's known as the infant industry argument, which says when an industry begins, when it's first born, it needs to grow very quickly. It needs protection while it's still young. But it should grow up. And once it does grow up, now the protection can leave. So again, if we come back here, you can see we could argue, some would argue, that we could use some protection up to here to get the industry going. But clearly, once the industry has expanded beyond Q1, there would not be any justification for continuing either tariffs or export subsidies to the Thai watch industry. Because at this point, it will be stealing market share away from the Swiss industry in any event. We'll talk about these arguments for temporary trade protection and the infant industry argument in particular in more specific details in, 2 weeks, I think, or something like that, but in the not too distant future. Now, one other issue about external economies of scale, what we said just a second ago was that even though we might have a disadvantageous pattern of specialization and trade, that is that Switzerland is producing watches even though it has a comparative disadvantage, it's still beneficial to the world because at a small scale of production, Switzerland will still charge a lower price than the Thai watch industry could. But we can also look at this from a national perspective. How are the countries better or worse off? So it turns out here that the outcome is actually much more ambiguous than what we've seen previously. To consider that, let's think about Thailand, having done the economic and engineering and marketing studies, knows that it has a comparative advantage in the watch industry. So now we need to get that industry started. So how do we start it? Well, one of the ways that we could do it is, let's just assume that we put on tariffs or other types of trade barriers that are so large that we actually have a domestic Thai watch market that will supply with a domestic Thai watch industry. So this would be like autarky. We're just going to take Thailand out of the world trading system for watches so that we can develop supply our domestic demand with the birth of a new domestic industry. Switzerland, of course, will be supplying the rest of the world market. So let's suppose then that the Thai average cost curve looks something like that, and that the Thai demand curve is here. Now, since we're starting this industry from scratch, we're not going to jump to QT immediately, but over some period of time, if that's where Thai demand curve is, what we see is that the industry will get started, output will begin to rise from 0 up to QT, no further, because that's all that the domestic market will actually support. Now, once the market gets to be this size, notice that we've passed, our price has come down below the Swiss price in the world market. So now the Thai watch industry can re-enter the world trading system for watches and actually be a very strong competitor against the Swiss, because they've managed to get large enough that they can now produce and sell watches at a lower price than the world market. That would be great unless the Thai domestic market is small. So notice that if this is where the Thai domestic market is, we can only support output at QT1, and we're going to have to charge a price of PT1. We'll get the industry started, there's no doubt about that. We'll move out from 0 to QT1 in terms of output. Price will come down, but we'll never get the domestic industry to be large enough to drive cost and prices down far enough to be able to compete on a global basis with the Swiss watch industry. Notice this comes back or demonstrates one of the things that we said earlier. If you have a large industry, if you have a large country with a large market, you can support a large industry. Okay? If Thailand were a really big country, it might be out here at this red demand curve. If Thailand's a small country, in terms of its domestic demand for the product relative to global demand for the product, then we're going to end up on the blue demand curve. So how big the country is that's trying to do this is relative to the size of the world market is also going to make a difference here. So if Thailand, even in this situation, or one of the things that's unusual maybe is to think, in this situation, the red demand curve for Thailand, Thailand's actually better off by not participating in international trade. So suppose that Thailand comes into the world trade market, but it only shifts this curve out a little bit because Thailand's still relatively small compared to the world demand. So the price is going to come down a little bit, but the Thai price would actually still be lower than the world price. So Thailand would be better off in autarky than with international trade, at least as far as watches are concerned. Not the case, obviously, if we have the blue demand curve for Thailand. In fact, if we do the blue demand curve for Thailand, they're obviously much worse off. Okay. Now, one of the things that we look at when we talk about forward falling supply curves or average cost curves, we saw this with what we did last time with average cost curves, not the monopolistic competition model itself, but looking at average costs and output, is we saw that as output for the firm increased, average costs came down, which is in fact what gives us internal economies of scale. With the external economies of scale, it's as the industry gets bigger, we become more efficient in production, that is, we can produce at lower cost, and again, we have forward falling supply curves or average cost curves. There's another situation that also takes place that is similar to external economies of scale, but also it's different. And so it's this difference that we want to talk about now. And this comes under the heading of something that is known as dynamic increasing returns. Dynamic increasing returns. So here what we're saying is it's not, our average costs don't come down as our output goes up. So think about our normal average cost curve. Let's see, where can I put it? This is normal. Well, it's not normal. It's normal with economies of scale. We have average cost, and we have the quantity over here. And so our average cost curves look like this. Notice we made that argument for imperfect competition in general, high fixed cost, low marginal cost. Your average cost curve will be declining. We'll have economies of scale over this period where the average cost curve is declining. Dynamic increasing returns are actually different. And what they're saying is that it's not what our current output is that determines our cost, but what our cumulative production is. Because as we produce more and more cumulatively, not in any given time period, but over time, we actually learn things about how the production process should be run. So if you thought about almost any complex good, that when you first are making the prototype, the first prototypes are generally incredibly expensive, right? Because you've never made one before. And then as you make more, you realize, oh yeah, instead of tab A into slot B, we really need to be putting tab C into slot B. So you figure out some of the ways of doing production that are more efficient. So that takes place when we have production experience. You've got to actually do it in order to get the experience. And then you get these spillover effects is, once you figure it out, your competitors, by watching you in part, but also by their own experimentation, figure out how to do that as well. So cumulative output becomes important here. And dynamic increasing returns are sometimes also referred to as learning curves, because we're learning as we produce more and more. So learning curves, I should probably have a L in there. Okay. So let's think about this. Now, notice here, I've got average cost. Here, I've got the summation of output over time. Now, it turns out that our average cost, our learning curve will have the same downward slope or look to it that we've seen earlier. But it's actually generated in a very different way. So let me add another little diagram up here where we're going to talk about average costs and current output. So notice again, we've got average cost on the vertical axis in both diagrams. But on the horizontal axis, in the big diagram, we've got the total summation of our output, so our total production experience as we move from the origin out. But here we just have current production. So here's what we're basically looking at. So this might be our average cost curve. And let's just assume that we're going to produce 10 units. So this might be a new airplane that Boeing is making. And they might only be able to make 10 a year, right? So on that first 10 that they make in year 0 or year naught, the average cost is pretty high because they haven't made this airplane before. So they don't know that tab B should go into, or tab C should go into slot B before tab A. But in the next year, having learned something about the production process, the average cost curve actually shifts down. We've become more efficient because we've done some production, and we've learned from that production technique. So now we have Still, we're only going to produce 10 units in the second year. So, but we now have a lower average cost associated with it. We got better at what we were doing. And then in year 3, we might get a little bit better yet, so that the average cost curve might fall again. Now, there is a limit to production learning. So this average cost curve isn't going to continue to fall year after year after year after year after year. Pretty soon you figured out almost everything you can figure out about the most efficient way to make things. So the average cost curve does flatten at some point. But notice that what we have here then, we're saying when we had 10 units, based on our learning curve, we didn't learn very well, so we actually have very high average costs. In the second year, notice we only produced 10 units in the second year, but our cumulative production is now up to 20. And so in that second year, we then see that our average costs come down to AC1. Now notice our current production schedule, what we're making each year, stayed the same. 10 in year 1, 10 in year 2. And in fact, in year 3, we're still going to make 10. But now our cumulative production is up to 30. And so we've gotten a bit more efficient in here. And so our average costs come down along this learning curve. Now you can probably figure out when the learning curve stops falling, when the average cost curves on current production stop falling, then the learning curve has to go horizontal. So it flattens out. So wherever that learning might take place. Okay? So this process here is referred to as dynamic increasing returns. Dynamic because we're learning as we're going along. As we increase the production, our average costs will come down. Oh, I just did that. I don't know why I have to do. Other than the fact that, notice that, again, just for highlight purposes, current production, when we talk about economies of scale, total production, cumulative production, when we talk about learning curves. Okay, I already said that. Okay, so let's do an example, see if this changes anything from what we've done before. So let's do two countries, the US and Taiwan. Oh, by the way, the reason I picked Switzerland and Thailand in watches before was because Switzerland dominates the world market. Thailand has comparative advantage in watches. Thailand had a huge fixed cost to overcome until a Swiss watch company called Swatch decided to make watches in Thailand. So that is a real example. This example is also a real one too. So this is US and Taiwan. Two slides are the same? Gee. Okay. One good, semiconductors. Now the US pioneered the industry. So one of the things that means, at least initially, total output in the US is greater than total output in Taiwan. Now, we can also say, let's suppose that Taiwan has lower production costs. Oh, sounds like Taiwan has a comparative advantage, but they also have less production experience. So what we end up then with is a learning curve for Taiwan that lies below the learning curve for the US. And notice that until Taiwan's cumulative output, yes, because we assume Taiwan had lower production costs than the US. Right? So at every level of cumulative output, they would also have lower costs. So, but notice that until Taiwan's cumulative production gets out to this point, red Q sub t, summation of red Q sub t, their average costs will always be higher than what they were in the US. So this is very similar but different. I mean, the pictures look similar. The analysis could be similar, but there's some subtle differences here between the economies of scale model that we were talking about earlier and the learning curves that we're looking at here. So once again, Taiwan has to get over its initial startup costs. Until it does, it has a potential comparative advantage. We know that that means it should dominate the semiconductor production of semiconductors. But again, until it gets to that cumulative production region, the US is still going to dominate the market. And once again, like we saw with regular external economies of scale, we can end up with disadvantageous patterns of specialization and trade. Even though that's the case, if Taiwan cannot get to that break-even cumulative production, it's still better for the world for the US to be producing because the price will be lower. Once again, we could say, wait a minute, what we really have here is a situation where Taiwan really ought to be the primary producer of this industry. All we need